So here's what I thought I would do. Um, I decided to skip chapter. The problem is the best chapters are obviously when all the strands come together and there's a lot of humor and pathos and whatnot based on the fact that you know who these people are and you've followed them. But that would require a ton of context that you don't have, and that I would bore you to tears to do it. That's why the book exists. So what I thought I'd do is the first chapter is some of the characters meeting in an elevator, and it's actually called "Stop Me If You've Heard This One." It's set up like a bad joke, and the alien is there too. The alien wanders into the elevator, and they is that a cosplayer? Like, what's going on here? But what happens in the following subsequent seven chapters is you get mostly very short, zippy chapters that tell you a little bit about how those people ended up there. And that might be what they were doing that morning that got them there, or it might be what they were doing like 30 years ago that set them on a path to becoming like a science fiction fan. So what I want to do is I'm going to read chapter 2, which gets you a little bit into Telfrin, and talk a bit. And then what we're going to do is you guys are going to pick. Those of you who are in the chat or who have my phone number can vote, and I'll say these are who the chapters deal with. Pick any two, and those will be the ones I read. The only one that's off the table for chapters 1 to 8 is chapter 7, because I think it's one of my favorite chapters in the book, it is the length of all those other chapters put together, and we would not have time, I think, to read that. So what I think I'm going to do is just keep in mind the people we're dealing with. We've got Telfrin, who calls himself a fat old nerd. We have the brothers from Michigan. We have one of the Janeites, who is cosplaying a character named Lady Susan Vernon, who was from a book that was not published in Austen's lifetime. It was something she wrote and never published. And then because she became Jane Austen, much later it was published. We have our teenage girls, including our elite athlete who arrives separately. So you can pick, and of course we have an alien. Although its first chapter is kind of info dumpy, I think. Although I think it's good info dump. So he flashes back after, because he mentions that that morning he was with someone named Denise Moon, and he realizes Denise Moon is going to be in the same hotel. And so chapter 2 starts us off. The epigram is one half of the world cannot understand the pleasures of the other, which is Jane Austen from Emma. I should say that what I'd been doing with Denise Moon earlier that day was sorting canned and packaged food. The other food drives never achieve the heights of activity and can stacks we see at midwinter, but they try. Now as then, the food bank maintains a flurry of activity while looking scandalously empty, because all of the regular volunteers are out picking up donations and we're understaffed at HQ. After the tragic turn in my 20s, I learned what it was like to rely on the kindness of people I would never meet. So I'm usually the volunteer left running the show while the schools and churches bring us beans and craft dinner and things discovered at the backs of shelves. Denise is a regular volunteer whose church pulls off miraculous hauls of donations. They needed help organizing at end of summer, and that was enough to get me into their rectory basement. I immediately recognized the boyish-faced minister. I lurk in libraries and peruse places that sell secondhand books, and I attended their summer rummage sale with Brian Slesick. We cleaned them out of the few solid SF paperbacks that we hadn't read yet. It happened the book table had a cardboard box labeled Discount Theological Books. I remarked to Brian that the box gave good advice. And Brian laughed his full braying laugh. The pastor, lingering behind me, retained his shiny appearance and polished personality. He even managed to smile. But the old ladies working the place looked scandalized, and I could tell in that instant that the pastor cared very much for the feelings of the old ladies. Such a creature oversaw the sorting that morning. The old lady and the pastor worked closer to the little stage on one end of the basement. Denise and I sorted foodstuff on the main floor. Belief in God be damned. They're feeding the hungry. Did Miss Moon pull me in? I have no delusions about myself. Even if I were a decade younger, she wouldn't be interested. I drew attention from women once, but by the time I understood that I did, Augusta had married Brian, and I had fallen deep into my crack-up. The loss of sanity and gainful employment left me focused on other matters. I make money now, to be sure, but my job as a clerk hardly nets what I made during those brief, shining years in chemical waste management. Time travel, alas, is not an option. I say this to Denise after giving her an abridged and vulgarized account of my life. But wouldn't you like to see the past? Denise Moon puts 3 more boxes of macaroni and cheese in their appointed places. I'm a huge reader of historical fiction, she says, and here she lowers her eyes a moment. I belong to the Jane Austen Society. I'd love to go to a Regency ball. You'd stand out at a Regency ball. Well, it's not as though it would happen. When I think of time travel, I think about my own life. But if I could do things over, what then? Could I have prevented the breakdown of my own chemical nature if I knew in advance it was going to occur? If I'd recognized Augusta's feelings, would we have been happy? Would she have nursed me back to health, ensured the medicinal regimen that keeps me sane? Or would I have simply laid low a woman who now seems perfectly content married to Brian, their daughters models of respect, responsibility, and normalcy? Would I, if I could go back, not be plagued with a desire to prevent crimes, disasters of which I would have foreknowledge? And if I placed a call, say, warning of the 9/11 attacks or some notorious killing, would it be traced? Or would I be rotting in a prison across the border? Could I have saved Stumbo, or would I have just driven him further into his dark paranoia? At lunch, I asked Miss Moon about the Jane Austen Society, a group I have hitherto lumped with Ioannan cargo cultists and furries. We sit on the floor surrounded by piles of processed food and hygiene products, like children in a schoolyard amidst playground equipment. The pastor and the old lady eat in the kitchen. In Toronto, she says, it's a small meeting of people from different chapters. Most of the local group are older women. Our chapter's president's husband, of course, who's a retired English teacher. A few are a bit younger. I'm our group secretary, so of course they really wanted me to be there. Toronto, I reflect, but I suppose that mentioning I would be heading in that general direction might reveal too much. I find her muted enthusiasm oddly engaging. I know her group also cosplays, Regency era ball gowns and greatcoats, Beau Brummel cravats. Well, she says, there's usually a reading or a musical performance at our larger gatherings. The performers might wear some sort of costume. And there's one very interesting woman about my age. We're rooming together, who always arrives as a character. Apparently this year she's doing Lady Susan Vernon. I don't know that character, I say, but I don't know Jane Austen. Oh, it's okay. Most people are not acquainted with Lady Susan. She's from an early book of Jane's that wasn't published during her life. Rather unusual book for its time. Lady Susan is a wicked woman, a conniver out for a wealthy husband, but she receives less consequences than you'd expect for a book of this era. That era. Oh, sorry, you probably find this tremendously dull. Oh, no, I'm fascinated by the triviality that become so important. I'm uncertain how to finish the sentence because her smile fades. Well, we should return to real work then, she says. I want to tell her that I meant triviality in a literal and non-pejorative sense, that I often immerse myself in trivialities, but I assume that anything I say now will be taken with some other shading. We pass the rest of the afternoon more silently than the morning, and with fewer pleasantries. We part with cool amicability, which the pastor and his assistants, for he acquired a second and third old lady in the afternoon, might have even noticed. He approaches me just before I leave. Thank you for your help, and God bless you. Anytime I can help with anything practical. Yes, of course. I know you didn't ask me, Telfrin, but I think a man is wise to ask questions. Still, I wouldn't discount the role of God. Of course, I say, a little surprised. Awaiting a denouement like, God has not discounted you, I smile. What else can I do? We shake hands and part. He's pleasant and sincere, and I cannot dislike him. I catch my ride out front of the church. Augusta and Brian Slessick unfailingly drive me to any con they are also attending, and they've been attending more now that their girls are older. Okay, so that's 2.
Thank you.
Thanks. In a little bit later, and I know Catherine wants me to read 8, which is a Janeite chapter. It's the other narrator. But just give some thought during the next bit. We have the American brothers, our nerdy American brothers, crossing the border. Just a couple of pages. We have Kate the athlete arriving in a science fiction convention, looking for her friends, and being completely lost. We have Chelsea and Katie and their backstory. And yes, I actually had somebody check my math in this chapter. And thank you for that. And then we get a little bit of the alien before we jump into chapter 7, which is quite lengthy, though I think quite moving. I think, and then chapter 8, which is the first Jane Austen chapter. So, in the comment section or in the text, if you want to let me know what you think we should read next. I was thinking about if you have questions about that, but I was thinking something I should have said when you asked me about the earlier drafts. There were some minor characters who got lots of space, and I thought this is a very crowded novel, intentionally, but I had to trim them out. So, for instance, the minor character who shows up and plays a key role, who's cosplaying Doctor Who, she and her friends had a much bigger role originally, and it wasn't that interesting. It was much more interesting if she just shows up briefly and acts like Doctor Who. Here, I'm going to solve your problem and go somewhere else now. And Polly, our gender non-specified, person who's helping run the con, was a little bit more developed, and as you know, Polly almost just becomes a reference to this colorful character, as science fiction conventions are filled with colorful people wearing colorful things, and Polly just is now isn't even a tertiary character. Polly is like an extra at this point. So anyway, any questions about what I read, about where you want me to read, or questions from you or from the people typing in questions?
And again, chat, please submit your votes for the next reading, whether you want to hear from Kate the athlete, the nerdy brothers from Michigan, Chelsea and Patty. We have lots of options, and they're all great chapters. So feel free to chime in on the chat. Let us know what you'd like JD to read next. So we've been talking a bit about the sci-fi aspect of the novel. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about the Austenite, the Janeite side?
The Janeites. Yeah, which I get because, of course, in chapter 1, when Telfrin meets Misty, who's cosplaying Lady Susan, he refers to them as Austenites, and she immediately, but nicely, corrects them, Janeites. We see them. It's interesting because the two Janeites we see most are Denise and Misty, and they're somewhat outliers. They're younger than most of the other people who have gathered there, and of course, Misty goes a bit AWOL. And she's a bit of an outlier for a Janeite. I'm sure there's going to be a few Janeites going, well, we're nothing like this one. But it's made clear that the other Janeites aren't much like. She likes the stuff they do, and the discussion of the period, and the study of the history, and learning how to do the dancing of the era, and the costumes, how to make the costumes of the era. But of course, the big event of their meeting is they're doing this evensong. They're doing this, basically it's a LARP of an Anglican religious service in which they're also reading or singing a piece that Jane wrote. And that becomes sort of the nexus point of the book's climax, is the fact that happens. And what that says about humanity. Even in an imitation of something that maybe nobody even involved in this necessarily believes, right? The Anglican priest is like a contractor in costume who's cosplaying and doing the service, but there's music, and of course Denise is a musician. And there was a lot of influence of the fact that I'm married to a singer. Denise is not a singer. I've made her a cellist. But that fact, I mean, at the core of this novel is the fact that everything that matters to humanity doesn't exist in a concrete sense. Um, we are driven by religion and politics is a weird fantasy league game. Um, and religion is based on things which may or may not have any real existence. It cannot be tested or verified. We are moved by feelings. We are moved by our emotions, and which could objectively be described as unstable chemical states, biochemical states, unstable biochemical reactions. And we are moved by music. There is not a single human culture that has not had music. Why? It doesn't, you can't say what music does. I have been moved by it. I am moved by Nancy singing. But we are all moved by music. Um, why? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have a practical person. It can be attached to rituals and stuff. Not that rituals are any less imaginary. And you can't point to it. You can experience it, you can play it, but you can't see, oh, see over there, there's a music. That doesn't exist. And yet it is so intrinsic to human experience that we have never had a human culture that we know of that hasn't had it. The thing doesn't exist. So the music, all I can tell you is that becomes very important. And although there's certainly lots of culture in science fiction, there is a kind of a cultural legacy that the Janeites are involved in what we do. And I don't want to go further than that, but I think that becomes the side of them that, so Telfrin can say in the second chapter that, yeah, so they were in a category in my brain with furries and cargo cultists. He can say that, but he hasn't wrestled with, he hasn't thought through that this is a diversion, but it's a diversion that's steeped in human culture, or one part of human culture. It's not the end-all and be-all of human culture. One of the things I find strange about the arguments about, the literary canon and Western culture and different cultural voices is the desire to say that one of them is somehow, oh, you're just saying this is more significant. No, I'm saying this is the stuff I'm interested in. You can be interested in this other stuff. Mm-hmm. I read science fiction. I read comic books, although not so much anymore. Those are cultural expressions. But I think there's something that would be more broadly recognizable in what the Janeites do. Once we get past, there's a bunch of people who are dressing up in costume of an era that, for most of the people living in that time wasn't as much fun as it was for the people of the classes, the class that Jane Austen is writing about. And, I'll leave it with that.
So you spoke a bit about the origins of some of the characters. While we're on the topic of the Janeites, tell us more about the origins of Misty as a character. She's a very interesting character, and you get a bit more of her in the book because she's a point of view character.
Yeah, she's the secondary point of view that is necessary to be there to show that there's another point of view besides Telfrin's that doesn't exactly contradict the notion that there could be an alien present, though it does present it in a different light. Misty started out just as, I thought it would be fun to have this character wandering around, who is an outlier even by Janeite standards, who is trying to write in a quasi-Jane Austen, a pastiche of Jane Austen's style, while being one of her characters. Actually, she ends up being two of her characters. And she keeps tripping over things that Jane Austen would never have written about, be it, science fiction conventions or, oral sex. I mean, she keeps tripping over stuff that is totally non-Janeite and is not Jane Austen at all. And yet for most of it, she maintains this pastiche that is, an approximation of someone who's not Jane Austen attempting to sound like Jane Austen. But I thought, I can't just have that character wander around. And again, in the first, actually the second draft, because she wasn't there at all in the first draft. In the second draft, she's kind of just there doing this thing. And I thought she needs, so I started developing a background for her. Who was she that led her? And we only gradually with her learn what that is and what her life was and why, and the life that she's living, which is kind of a different life than most of the people she knows. And she's a very within any fandom, you find some people who are very lonely in their real lives, and the fandom is their way of getting out and socializing. And this is not everybody who's in a fandom, and anybody who tries to do the all science fiction fans or all Janeites are all sort of pathetic basement dwelling losers does not know what they're talking about and is an idiot. But there are some very lonely people, and Misty is someone who was living a very different life when she was Patty and Chelsea's age, and a very active sort of, she was sort of on the periphery of a sort of a group of sort of party group that we all know in high school. And as an adult, her life went in a very different direction. And I wanted to explore that by looking at my own imagination. It's fiction, and we can talk about that later because we had some interesting discussions about that. Where is Rose Point? Yeah, so I wanted to get into exploring what her past has been and how, but also as a very intelligent person, she at some point began reading Jane Austen at a time when there wasn't anything else for her to do, and because of the circumstances of her life that had changed, and she thought, oh, this is just this fascinating world, which it is. Sure, Jane Austen and science fiction. Yeah, Jane is now showing us a world that she wasn't at the time, but she's now showing us a world that we don't live in. And that led her to the Jane Austen Society of people who are fascinated by this very significant figure in English literary history.
Misty is also a very interesting character in the context of the story because it seems like, unlike all the other characters who are kind of connected to each other one way or another, she's, only tangentially connected to Denise Moon.
Right.
So she provides a very interesting perspective on everybody else. So I can definitely see how she became an important character for portraying the story that way.
An outsider among people who are often regarded as outsiders by mundane culture. And yes, I recognize that is maybe not the nicest word that science fiction fans use. And there's no question that Muggles and Harry Potter is absolutely inspired by the fact that SF and fantasy fans refer. But I mean, we'll also often refer to our mundane lives, the life that we live outside of science fiction. I have to go back to my mundane job, unless you're somebody who who works in the industry, and even then, it's still work.
Yeah.
So. One of the things I found interesting about Telfrin as a character is he gave me free rein. I love puns, not everybody does, and buried references and allusions, and I will do them. But because of the nature of Telfrin's personality and the fact that categories do break down with Telfrin, and the fact that he reads compulsively, and he may actually be in touch with other people's brains through a kind of alien brain-to-brain interface. The jury's out on that. His narration is buried with that, and I was filled with that, and I love doing that because you can read it and miss all of them and not miss the story at all. And then you reread a chapter, and almost every third page of Telford has something like that robot battle. When it's describing, they're in an underground parking garage, and it says something like, Mark felt secure in such environments, or something like that. And it's a reference to the fact that Mark as a character does hide a bit, and he's a bit shy. He likes to hide behind things. So of course he would feel safe in an underground parking garage. But because Telfrin's categories are always breaking down, Mark Felt. Oh, Mark Felt is, of course, the actual name of the Watergate informant, Deep Throat, and and we are in an underground parking garage where these characters are encountering obscure, forbidden knowledge. Um, Telfrin does that constantly, and if you don't see it, it doesn't matter. It's not like, see, this is here. It's if you catch it, it's there. Um, and in that way, I buried tons of ridiculous Easter eggs in Telfrin's narration that have multiple meanings, but they're also just symptomatic of the fact that he's having trouble keeping his brain straight. The categories just keep breaking down for him, and puns are where language breaks down, where it doesn't quite make sense, or it doesn't make the sense you want it to make. And so he was fun to write from that point of view because I just could give free rein for the tendency that, if you read the two follow-up stories, that's almost completely absent, that kind of nonsense, because they're different stories with their own tone. But Telfrin, part of the fun is you can go back to his narration, and I think anyway, other people say, you're just being an idiot here, but you can go back and find all of this craziness and the biblical allusions and the mythological allusions and the punning, and but it's kept in a way that is not, see, you got to know this to read the story. No, you don't. You don't know any of it to read the story. You just, the story, if the story cannot be read by someone who just likes to read and enjoyed, that's not necessarily I might write a story like that, but I would not want to write a book like that. It's sort of like, I'm a great admirer of James Joyce, but there's that part of me that says, Ulysses, and of course Finnegan's Wake. I mean, at what point are you just giving a challenge to your reader instead of a book that they might want to read? Although there's much pleasure to be had in Ulysses, and I assume one of these days I'll get back to Finnegan's Wake because I've read Ulysses twice and especially the second time really enjoyed it. But that's, even if I could write something like that, that would not be what I would be writing. I want people to like the characters or the story, or one of those things that people read because that's what they want to see. And then if there's other levels they get out of it, or things that I didn't think about that ended up being there because that's how characters interact like people, that's awesome. Great. Tell me all about it, whether it's a positive or negative. I can learn from that too, because books do things that the writers are not seeing. We go back and we say, oh, that's kind of about that. I remember early in our relationship, my wife read a story of mine, said, hey, this is about this thing that happened to you. And I said, no, it's not. Oh, yeah, I guess it is. I just completely turned it into something else. And by extension, it's about other similar things that have happened to a million other people. But I think if you make the characters work, people will find their way to jump into them, and they'll say, I could relate to this character, but not this character. Or I thought this was funny, but I thought, well, that joke belongs, in the mouth of someone's dad at a barbecue. Whatever. People will see it differently, and I'm good with that.
So you were talking about some classic literature there. So how many Jane Austen books have you read?
I haven't read Mansfield Park, and probably should. At different times in my life, I've read through Jane, and when I went to write this, I actually listened to the audiobook of Lady Susan while I was driving. I was working in a small town near London, Ontario, where I live, and so I was doing a lot of audiobooks because I had an hour drive to and from work for those years, and I actually listened to that, and then I downloaded a copy and tried to get a sense, not just of Jane Austen, but of how the young Jane Austen wrote in the her epistolary novel about Lady Susan. Did I succeed? I have no idea. I suspect this is going to be read as you know, a copy went to quite a noted Jane Austen scholar in Louisiana, and I suspect she will either say you need to do this a little better, or you know what, it's that character, and I'll accept it on that, or maybe hey, you got this part, sounds good. So we'll see how that and if you're out there, hi. So, do we read more, or do we have more questions? Because I know that the people here are going to come and go depending on what's interesting. And are there any people suggesting possible readings?
So we had someone in the chat who wanted to hear chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Wait, which chapter is 5?
Gotta get out mine as well. Oops, too far.
Oh, that's the Chelsea and Patty
Yes.
chapter. Okay, let's do. And this is kind of interesting because we're now getting into. I'm going to work with teenagers, and the teenage parts, as you know, were read by a 15-year-old who gave me some really interesting feedback. Now, 15-year-old in London, Ontario is different from 15-year-old in small, coastal, a little bit redneck town. Okay, chapter 5. My God, it's full of starfruit. Chelsea, because we've just had a Kate chapter, and Kate's gonna try and hook up with her friends. It's surprising them. She hasn't texted because she wants to make this a surprise, and there are reasons for that. So she's convinced her. Well, we don't have to get into that. Chelsea, at that moment, could be found sitting in a room reserved in Patty's father's name, reflecting on things that haven't happened. She recalls months of Katie, getting closer to Katie, mismatched classroom friends, sideways glances over the planning of D-Day and the conductivity of pure substances, and the jocks asking Kate, does she ever talk about... I mean, it was them, right? At the start of the previous school year, she and Patty hacked the Board of Education. Patty figured Tech Club needed a reputation makeover. She assured Chelsea she did not care about popularity. But notoriety? A shot across the bow, and don't anyone be fucking with us and ours? They tweaked a laptop and jacked the Wi-Fi from the local hotel. Suddenly, people clicking anywhere on the Board of Education site, days before Grade 9 Parents' Night, got redirected to an online video of "You Are a Pirate" from that Icelandic kids show. A cheap ploy, to be sure, because pirates have been the school's team since '35. The school's mascot, a parrot in tricorn, often seen swinging a toy sword on the sidelines. Law enforcement couldn't trace the hack further than the Wi-Fi at the local hotel. Couldn't prove a thing, which meant everyone knew it had to be Patty and Chelsea. Sitting in the office, recognizing that neither school admin nor cops knew anything, Patty helpfully suggested that if someone could so easily hack the board's servers, they needed to tighten security. Just a suggestion, brown eyes blinking. Are we done here yet? The inhabitants of Teen World, through appreciative nods, began stepping aside faster, polite and a little bit frightened. Patty Washington, evil genius. It's a mixed blessing, really, because Chelsea likes these other kids. Chelsea and Kate by then talked together outside of class, sometimes, picking up where they almost started in grade 9. Chelsea began watching girls' basketball games, running the scoreboard even, sometimes. So by spring, Kate can mention a party, the kind Chelsea and Patty roll eyes about, hormonally turned up, loud. The partiers eyed them, mismatched friends with matching brunette ponytails. But Chelsea's affable, and Kate's a star, and a small town lagging a decade behind social attitudes hasn't asked the question aloud yet. And neither has Kate, exactly. The pair left when beer started spilling from bottles and high fructose alcohol from red cups, because that isn't Kate's thing either. Kate walked her home. They talked, eyes wide, but a safe space between them. The hug goodnight lasts longer than Regulation Girl. Chelsea and Patty were sitting in the school library a week later when Lucas and Steve approached them. Lucas is a blonde Kalel, minus the spit curl and alien heritage. Farm boy, quarterback, point guard, small-town celebrity. Also, math whiz. Patty outthinks him, but he can follow her when she does. Lucas knew he was staring the answer in the face and couldn't see it. Steve took the time to joke with Chelsea, because after the party, they're apparently old friends. But Chelsea keeps an eye on Patty. Given 5 points on a sphere, show that there is a closed hemisphere that contains at least 4 of them. Lucas barely had time to blink before Patty said, 2 points on a sphere determine the boundary of a hemisphere, a great circle. If the northern hemisphere doesn't have another 2 points, then the southern hemisphere has to have 2 points. Of course, Lucas said. Well, duh, said Steve. Dude, you didn't understand that at all. Oh, I stop listening when girls talk about great cycles. Chelsea giggled. Circles. I'll hit him if you want, Lucas offered. Perhaps later, Patty said. I'll hit myself. That was a fail. Chelsea patted him on the shoulder. Kate passed by about that and joined them tableside. Patty saw some of the other library regulars looking over like they were in a club, and her table was where the band took their break. Lately, it seemed their star was rising, though Patty maintained she didn't care one way or the other. Of all the guys, Kate seems closest to these two. She treats Steve like a brother. Bro hugged him on arrival, in fact. And Patty's sure Lucas has Kate and Chelsea figured out, even if Kate hasn't, but he'd never say anything if he did. Kate fist bumped him and then hugged Chelsea, but all girly and friendly. Chelsea left the library with her. So I'll see you after school, she said to Patty. Patty saw Lucas and Steve's eyes following asses out. Anyway, she said. Thanks. You would have got it. You just saw it. Jesus, all we have to do is show the work. Like a free throw, Steve said. It's a pity, she thought. Lucas is Lucas, and she accepted that, untouchable like some kind of copyright character. Redhead Sarah had him, a superficially pleasant girl and, predictably, a cheerleader, the kind Sarah's quick to note who do real gymnastics. But Patty felt something else about Steve, despite his intellectual limitations. She wished she didn't. She let herself laugh, and Steve looked satisfied. Guys are easy, at least at this level. She sits on her hotel bed, leafing through the program, her brown eyes behind Buddy Holly's specs. The room's theirs, entirely, courtesy of the professor, who will not be joining them this year. Chelsea pulls on a pink and purple top and glances in the mirror. You could have been nicer to the Klingon. I always could have been nicer, Patty says. We ready? Chelsea puts purple lens glasses over dull-sized eyes and throws thumbs up. The girls head to the consuite. It is a high-caliber consuite under the direction of a citizen-haired person named Polly. Beyond the expected chips and nuts and peeps, they've got chili and fruit salad and caffeinated bacon. Coffee in 3 varieties, decaffeinated, regular, and one brewed with caffeinated water. Cans of beer and alcoholized energy drinks will materialize in the bathtub sometime after 8. For now, it holds ice and soft drinks and water. A prudent Polly has duct taped the toilet shut. Patty grabs a PC Cola and a strawberry soy milk and scopes out seats near the middle-aged man from the elevator because she and I have spoken at cons past. Chelsea scoops fruit onto a pair of paper plates and joins her friend. There's berries and pineapple and starfruit, she says. What's up with starfruit? Patty, considering the green offerings. Doesn't taste like anything. It's shaped like stars. So that's all it brings to the table? It's star-shaped? Pretty much. It's like the boy band of fruit. It probably has, like, nutrients. That's good, someone says. Boy band of fruit. I laugh. We look up to see Mark the Klingon and his brother Thomas. And that's it. We get more of that later. Thanks.